The morning air was still over the eastern edge of the reserve, the grass pale from the cool night. Moving along a narrow track, the ranger slowed when he noticed an odd patch ahead, not the usual sway of resting animals, but a dense, unmoving shape. Through the grass tips, the tan curve of a lioness's flank was visible. She lay on her side, her body stretched in the brittle stems, head angled toward the horizon. Close against her ribcage, a much smaller shape stood barely taller than the grass. A cub, thin-legged and still, pressed into her as if the touch alone could anchor it. He stepped down from the vehicle, moving with measured pace. The cub's ears flicked, but it did not step away, its attention fixed on the unmoving body beside it. From this distance, the signs were clear. The lioness's eyes were half closed, her flanks no longer rising. There was no sound of breath, no stir of muscle under her coat. The night had taken her quietly, leaving the cub alone in the tall grass. A few steps closer, and the cub shifted only to keep its shoulder against her, the rest of its body stiff. It let out a small, rasping cry that hung in the air and faded almost immediately. Its tail was low, its back legs slightly trembling. He knew the moment for decision had already come. A cub this young, without pride, had hours at most before heat, hunger, or another predator closed in. If it stayed here, it would not survive the day. The grass around them carried the sharp scent of dust and the faint musk of the lioness's coat. Flies gathered along her face and flank. Overhead, a lone vulture traced a circle, drifting lower with each pass. The ranger's boots pressed softly into the dry earth as he closed the last meters. The cub turned its head toward him, eyes wide and unfocused, a mix of instinctive caution and uncertainty. He crouched, resting one knee in the dirt. The cub made no move to flee, only shifted its weight so that its body was still against the lioness's ribs. He reached out slowly, letting his hand hover just above its shoulder before resting it gently on the coarse fur. There was a faint tremor beneath his palm, not from fear alone, but from exhaustion. "It's okay," he murmured, barely above a whisper, the sound carrying only to the small ears before him. The cub didn't pull away. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, leaning into the contact in a way that seemed more from fatigue than trust. He slid one arm beneath its chest, feeling the delicate bones and light weight, and lifted it against him. The animal's legs hung limp at first, then tucked slightly as he adjusted his hold. Against his shirt, the cub's body was warm, its breathing shallow but steady. Behind him, the lioness lay unchanged, her form already beginning to settle into the grass. He knew leaving her would be necessary. The priority was the living. The track back to the vehicle felt longer with the quiet weight in his arms. Each step carried the unspoken fact that the cub's survival now rested on what came next: water, shelter, and protection from the open plains. At the side of the vehicle, he opened the rear compartment and eased the cub into a shallow crate lined with an old blanket. The cub did not resist, only curling slightly, eyes still on the horizon where its mother lay. The ranger shut the door gently, the muted sound feeling louder than it was in the quiet morning. As he turned the vehicle toward the main track, the grass closed over the place where the lioness had fallen. The cub shifted once inside the crate, but stayed low. The day ahead would bring heat quickly, and with it the dangers that moved when shade was scarce. For now, the only thing certain was that the small life beside him was still breathing, and that had to be enough to carry them both to the next hour. The vehicle idled a few meters away, its low hum fading as the ranger cut the engine. The air was warming now, the sun lifting higher, and with it came the sharper sense of the grassland. He moved back toward the patch where the lioness had fallen, his boots pressing through the dry stems until her body filled his view again. Her head rested at an unnatural angle, jaw slack, eyes half-lidded in a way that left no doubt. The rise and fall of breath he had hoped to see was absent. Her chest remained still beneath the mottled fur. The cub stood exactly where it had been, pressed into her ribcage as though it could warm back into her body. A thin sound broke from its throat, a high, wavering cry that seemed to fade as soon as it left the air. The ranger paused just outside its reach, letting the moment pass without movement. Small flies clustered around the lioness's muzzle, undisturbed by her stillness. The cub twitched its ears but made no attempt to chase them away, its eyes fixed somewhere beyond the ground at its feet. He shifted closer, crouching low to take in what was left. The lioness's coat was dulled by dust, and along her flank, faint ridges of ribs showed under the skin. She was not old, but her body told of lean seasons and long distances. The cub's coat, in contrast, was softer, the spots on its legs still visible, marking it as very young, perhaps no more than a few months. Alone, it had no way to feed itself. By nightfall, without shelter or food, its chances would be gone. The cub moved then, but only to circle once around her head and press its face briefly against her cheek. It gave another call, softer this time, before returning to her side and standing there as if nothing had changed. The ranger felt the weight of the decision in front of him. To wait meant certain loss, to move now meant separating it from the last familiar thing it had. The sun was climbing, and with the light came the scavengers. He could already see 2 vultures settling on a low branch in the distance, their wings shifting restlessly. He stepped forward again, careful not to startle the cub. It turned its head toward him at last, eyes clear but unreadable. The ranger lowered himself slowly, resting one hand on the ground before reaching out with the other. The cub gave a small shiver, but did not step away, its paws planted in the trampled grass. He let his fingers brush the fur at its shoulder, warm, tense under his touch. "It's all right," he said quietly. The words carried more in tone than meaning. The cub held its place, only tilting its head back toward the lioness once more. The bond was visible in its stillness, a quiet refusal to leave. He stayed there for a few moments longer, his hand resting gently against its side, before leaning closer. With slow, deliberate care, he slid one arm beneath its chest. The cub's legs stiffened but did not strike out. It was light in his hold, fragile in a way that made the urgency more pressing. He stood, cradling it against him, the scent of its coat mingling with the dry, sun-warmed air. The cub shifted once, looking over his arm toward the place it had stood moments before. The lioness remained in the grass, her body unmoved, the shadow she cast already shortening. The ranger turned back toward the vehicle, each step taking the cub farther from the only anchor it had known. By the time they reached the open track, the vultures had edged closer, their black eyes fixed on the still shape in the grass. The cub pressed its head against his chest, the trembling in its legs now replaced by a slow, steady breathing. The risks were unchanged: hunger, heat, and the long journey to care, but for now it was alive in his arms, and that was something he could protect. The heat was beginning to settle over the plain, the cool edge of morning fading fast. The ranger stayed low beside the cub, his knees pressed into the brittle stems. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The cub's small frame was rigid, but not in fear, more as if all its energy was locked in, holding its place against the lioness's body. Her fur shifted slightly in the breeze. But the stillness beneath was absolute. There was no delay left to take. The sun would soon be high, and predators and scavengers would follow its rise. He shifted his weight forward, letting his hand rest again on the cub's side. The animal gave no start, only flicking one ear at the contact. Slowly, he brought his other arm underneath, feeling the slight give of its ribs, the warmth of its belly against his forearm. Its muscles tensed for an instant, then relaxed as he began to lift. The cub's paws hung loosely, its tail brushing against his wrist. When he straightened to his full height, the cub did not wriggle or push away. Instead, its head turned inward, pressing into the rough fabric of his shirt just above his chest. The weight was light, startlingly so for an animal whose survival felt so heavy in his arms. He adjusted his grip, supporting the body fully, the small heartbeat faint but steady against his own. The air between them carried no struggle. Only the quiet surrender of an animal too young to understand the change but willing to accept it. The walk back toward the vehicle was unhurried, each step deliberate to keep the cub steady. Around them, the grass shifted in muted waves, the landscape indifferent to the moment. A pair of vultures lifted off from the far side of the clearing, circling once before drifting higher. Insects buzzed low over the lioness's body, now a shape already folding back into the color of the earth. Halfway to the vehicle, the cub stirred slightly, not to pull away but to adjust its position, tucking its head more firmly under his arm. Its breathing slowed, the earlier tremor gone from its legs. The ranger kept one hand curved over its back, the other under its chest, ensuring it was held close but without force. He knew the stillness now could change quickly. A sudden noise, the sight of another animal. But for this short stretch, there was no resistance. At the vehicle, he opened the rear compartment with the edge of his boot, then eased the cub down into the crate waiting inside. It was lined with an old blanket, softened by years of use. The cub curled naturally, paws folding under, head still turned toward the side as though seeking something beyond the metal walls. The ranger crouched beside it, resting a hand lightly on its shoulder for a moment longer. "There you go," he said softly, the words almost lost in the hum of the warming air. The cub blinked once but didn't move away. He shut the crate door gently, the latch clicking without sharpness. Around them, the day was brightening, the sky deepening toward a harsher blue. In the driver's seat again, he glanced once through the mesh of the crate. The cub's eyes were half closed, its body settled in the small hollow it had made in the blanket. They still had distance to cover before shelter, before water, before the first real safety this animal might know. The risks were plain. The heat could still take it, and stress could weaken it further. But for the first time since he'd seen it, the cub was no longer standing in loss. It was lifted, carried, and for now, alive. The drive back toward the outpost cut across open stretches of grassland where the sun already pressed hard against the earth. Heat shimmered low above the track, and the smell of dry dust trailed behind the vehicle. The cub lay curled in the crate, the blanket shifting slightly with each slow breath. Every so often, it lifted its head as if to reorient, then lowered it again, eyes half-lidded. By the time the ranger reached the shaded edge of the compound, the air was heavy and close. He parked in the lee of a low shed where the temperature dropped a few degrees and the ground was cool underfoot. Opening the rear, he crouched beside the crate and unlatched the door. The cub did not rush out. Instead, it blinked at the change in light, nose twitching faintly at the scents drifting in. Dry grass, old wood, the faint musk of other animals once held here. He slid his arms gently around its middle and lifted it free, feeling again the slight weight and the way its paws hung loose before tucking against his chest. In the corner of the shed, a larger crate waited, lined with a folded blanket that still held the faint smell of sun and soap from its last wash. He set the cub down inside, letting it find its own place. It moved only enough to shift the blanket under its body, then stayed still. From a cooler nearby, he took a small bottle filled with warm milk replacement, the formula mixed thin for easier drinking. Kneeling at the open crate door, he eased the teat toward the cub's mouth. At first it only sniffed, ears twitching, but after a moment it latched on, the first pull strong but uneven. The liquid disappeared slowly, the cub pausing every few swallows as though unsure of this new thing. Between sips, its eyes fluttered closed, opening again only to resume drinking. The ranger kept one hand steady under the bottle and the other resting lightly along the cub's back. "That's it," he murmured, the words quiet and even. Each time the cub paused, he waited, letting it set the pace. In the stillness, the sounds were small but clear, the soft draw of breath, the faint creak of the blanket shifting under its paws. When the bottle was nearly empty, the cub pulled back, a small bead of milk clinging to its whiskers. It licked once at the air, then lowered its head to the blanket, eyes closing fully this time. The ranger capped the bottle and set it aside, watching the rise and fall of its chest. For now, the signs were good. The breathing was steady, the body warm, the eyes closing from contentment rather than exhaustion alone. But the danger was far from gone. Heat stress, dehydration, and shock could turn quickly, especially in one so young. He reached to pull the crate door closed, leaving a gap wide enough for air to move through. Outside, the sunlight glared on the compound walls, but here, the shade held. The cub shifted once, curling tighter around itself, tail tip brushing its own hind leg. The ranger stood, stretching his back from the crouch, and glanced toward the horizon beyond the fence. Somewhere out there, the body of the lioness lay where he had left it, the grass closing around her. Here, in this shaded crate, was what remained of her line, one small life that, with enough care, might see another dawn. For now, the only thing certain was that it had drunk, It had rested, and it was safe from the sun. The light faded early over the reserve, the heat of the day giving way to a cooler, drier air that moved softly through the open windows of the ranger station. In one quiet corner, away from the sounds of radios and boots on the wooden floor, the cub lay curled on its side inside a low pen made from stacked crates. The blanket beneath it was pulled into a rough nest, the fabric rising and falling with each slow breath. The ranger sat at a nearby desk, paperwork spread before him, but his attention turning often toward the pen. The first hours of rest had been deep, the cub barely stirring except to change position. But as the night came on, he knew the dangers did not ease. Young animals could fade quickly. Dehydration creeping in, body temperature dropping too low, shock taking hold even after rescue. Every so often, he crossed the short space to crouch beside it, watching the shape of its ribs move, listening for any unevenness in the rhythm. Near midnight, he warmed a small bottle of milk formula over a kettle and knelt again at the pen. The cub lifted its head at the faint scent, ears twitching forward before it latched weakly onto the teat. The pulls were slow but steady, the sound of swallowing faint in the stillness. When it had taken enough, he offered a small dish of water. It sniffed, lapped twice, then turned its head back toward the blanket. He set the dishes aside, brushing a hand gently over the cub's flank before letting it settle again. The station at night was never fully quiet. A distant call from the bush, the hum of an old fridge in the corner, the occasional clink of metal as the wind moved something outside. But the pen remained calm. The cub adjusting its position now and then with a soft rustle of fabric. Each time the ranger checked, he counted the breaths, noting the warmth still in its body. "Still with us," he would murmur, more to himself than the animal. In the small hours before dawn, the air cooled sharply. He added a folded cloth over part of the pen to hold the warmth in, sliding another layer under the cub without waking it fully. It shifted once, pressing its head into the corner as though finding a better hold on sleep. The breathing stayed slow, the signs still good. But the thought lingered. One long night did not mean survival. The next day would bring new tests: feeding, hydration, the stress of confinement. When the first gray light touched the edges of the window, he was there again with fresh milk, the bottle warmed in his hands. The cub rose clumsily this time, its legs stiff from rest but willing. It drank a little more eagerly than before, the pause between swallows shorter. Afterward, it licked at the blanket, as if testing the scent of the place that now held it. As the sun began to lift, the ranger sat back on his heels, letting out a slow breath. The cub had made it through the first night, fragile still but breathing, drinking, and alive. Outside, the reserve was waking, and with it came the work of another day. Inside, in the quiet corner, one life had been carried a little further from the edge. The morning sun filtered in at an angle through the high windows of the holding area, touching the dust motes that drifted in the still air. The cub was already awake, sitting near the edge of its pen, head tilted toward the low chain divider that separated it from the next enclosure. Its ears moved in small flicks, catching sounds too soft for the human ear, the slow breathing of another animal nearby. The faint scrape of claws against wood. Across the divider, a second pen held another young lion, slightly older and with a leaner build, its coat a shade darker from longer days outdoors. This cub had been rescued weeks earlier and was stronger now, its steps sure even on the smooth concrete floor. It paced once along the boundary, then stopped, watching the newcomer with a still, quiet focus. The rescued cub rose on unsteady legs, the movement careful as though each step needed testing. Its tail hung low at first, tip twitching slightly, and it took 2 short steps forward before pausing to steady itself. The space between them closed slowly, each footfall placed with care, until the two stood a breath apart. The older cub lowered its head, nostrils flaring to catch the scent of the newcomer. The smaller one leaned forward, their noses meeting in a brief, almost tentative touch. The ranger stood a few meters back, watching without stepping in. He knew the risks were minimal here. Both animals were too young for aggression, and the divider would hold. But the interaction mattered. A solitary young lion was vulnerable not just to hunger or predation, but to the absence of its own kind. This was how the process began, with recognition and quiet curiosity replacing fear. The smaller cub's tail lifted slightly, a small but telling shift in body language. It stepped closer to the mesh, pressing its nose through one of the gaps. The older cub mirrored the movement, their whiskers brushing for a moment before they both drew back. No sound passed between them, only the unspoken exchange of scent and presence. After a minute, the younger cub sat back on its haunches, still facing the other pen. Its breathing was steadier than it had been the day before, the tremor in its legs less pronounced. The older cub gave a slow blink, then turned to walk a short circle before returning to the same spot. As if to confirm the newcomer had not moved, the ranger crouched, placing a shallow dish of milk near the front of the pen. The younger cub turned to drink, lowering its head without hesitation. Behind the divider, the older cub watched the movement, then moved to its own water bowl, lapping in an almost mirrored rhythm. For the ranger, the sight carried quiet reassurance, the small signs that the rescued cub was adapting, finding comfort in the nearness of another life shaped like its own. When the bottle feeding was done, the cub lay down near the divider, its flank pressed lightly to the mesh. The older cub settled on the other side, not touching but close enough that their breathing seemed to fall into the same slow pattern. The day outside was warming, the calls of birds and the distant rumble of vehicles filtering in. But here in the shaded pens, the first thread of connection had been woven. The ranger stepped back, leaving them in the stillness. It would take time for strength to return, and the dangers of the wild were far from over. But for the first time since lifting the cub from the grass, he saw a moment that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The days that followed brought small but steady changes. The younger cub's steps grew firmer, its ribs less pronounced under the softening coat. Feeding times no longer carried the urgency of those first days. It drank eagerly, then settled near the older cub, the space between them shrinking until they rested side by side against the divider. By the end of the week, the ranger knew the time had come for the next stage, a move to a safe release area where they could grow within a protected range, away from roads and scavengers. The morning of the transfer was clear and warm, the kind of day when the grass swayed in unbroken waves across the low hills. The ranger worked quietly, bringing the travel crates into the holding area. The older cub stepped into its crate with only a moment's pause, used to the presence of people and short relocations for health checks. The younger cub hesitated at the open door, its paws pressed to the concrete floor, but the soft coaxing and the scent of the blanket inside eased its step forward. Once in, it turned a slow circle before settling down, tail curled close. The drive was long enough for the sun to climb higher, shadows drawing shorter across the track. From time to time, the younger cub shifted in its crate, ears turning toward the occasional rustle from the other. The ranger kept the journey steady, avoiding the deep ruts that could jolt the fragile calm. By midday, the narrow road opened onto the edge of a fenced reserve, a protected release zone where the cubs could begin learning the rhythms of the wild with reduced risk. Inside the gate, the grass grew thick and tall, dotted with acacia and the occasional patch of open ground where the sun pooled. The ranger set the crates down side by side, unfastening the latches without hurry. The older cub stepped out first, head high, scanning the open space before moving a few paces forward. The younger cub stayed at the threshold, nose working the air, paws half hidden in the crate's shadow. The moment stretched until the older cub turned back, giving a short huff through its nostrils. At that, the younger stepped out, its legs carrying it directly to the other's flank. They moved forward together, the smaller keeping so close their shoulders brushed. The scent of grass and warm earth rose around them, the air holding the faint hum of insects. The ranger stood a short distance away, still and watchful. As the pair reached the taller grass, the younger cub glanced back once. Its eyes found him briefly before it turned away, following the older into the swaying cover. The sound of their movement faded quickly, swallowed by the rustle of stems and the open space beyond. He remained there for a few minutes, scanning the grass for any sign of them. A faint ripple marked their path for a while longer, then nothing, just the wind bending the tops of the grass. The release did not end the risks. The cubs would face weather, hunger, and the slow work of learning to hunt, but they would face it with the nearness of their own kind, a bond that had begun in the quiet of a holding pen. When the ranger finally turned back toward the vehicle, the sun was high, the heat pressing against his shoulders. Somewhere in that expanse, two young lions were moving together toward a life no longer bound by walls. For now, that was enough. The day had run long, the ranger's work carrying him to the far edges of the reserve as the sun began to lower. The light turned the grassland gold, shadows stretching thin across the ground. On the return track, he slowed near a low ridge that rose gently from the plain. Against the sky, two shapes stood side by side, small in the distance but unmistakable. The older cub's frame had filled out, its stance now steady and sure. Beside it, the younger stood slightly closer, body angled toward its companion as though taking measure from its stillness. The breeze lifted their fur in faint ripples, carrying the scent of the grass across the open space. They were not moving to hunt or rest. They simply stood, their attention on the far horizon where the land dipped into shadow. He kept the vehicle idling far below, unwilling to break the moment with sound or movement. The cub shifted once, the younger brushing its flank lightly against the other's side. It was a small gesture, quick enough to miss if he had looked away, but it carried the same quiet thread that had linked them in the holding pen. For a few minutes, the three of them shared the same piece of evening. Two lions framed against the fading light, one man watching from the edge of their world. The risks they faced were unchanged. Nights could bring cold or prowling hyenas, the hunt could fail, and the weather could turn without warning. But they had made it beyond the fragile place of dependency, their survival now tied to the land and to each other. The older cub moved first, turning toward the slope that led down the far side of the ridge. The younger followed immediately, glancing once over its shoulder. Even at this distance, he caught the brief flash of its eyes before it turned back, matching step with its companion. The two slipped over the ridge, their shapes thinning into silhouettes before they were gone entirely, leaving only the warm haze where the sun touched the dust. He sat for a while longer, watching the ridge as the light deepened toward orange, and then into the cooler tones of evening. The grass moved softly under the wind, erasing the last signs of their passage. Somewhere beyond, they would find a place to rest, pressed close for warmth as night settled in. As he turned the vehicle back toward the station, the sound of the first night birds carried across the open air. He thought of the morning when he had first seen the smaller cub pressed against the lifeless flank of its mother, the thin cry that had cut the silence of the grass. That sound had faded long ago, replaced by the steady rhythm of movement alongside another. By the time the sun was gone, the ridge was only a darker line against the dim sky. The memory of their shapes held clearly in his mind. The land was quiet again, but somewhere in that quiet, two young lions walked together into the night.